Hey everyone, tonight, we're diving headfirst into the bizarre, occasionally grotesque, and unintentionally hilarious world of medieval medicine. Picture this. Scholars who lean heavily on guesswork, wearing enormous robes and radiating unwavering confidence. Drop a comment below with your location and local time. We always love seeing who's tuning in from where. Alright, global audience noted, dim the lights, maybe fire up a fan if you can stand the hum, and let's settle into this wild medieval journey together. You are a medieval doctor, oozing confidence, not because you passed an exam or trained under a guru, but because you've snagged a long robe, can pronounce phlegmatic, and own some Latin text you skimmed during a thunderstorm. You awake in your half-timbered cottage just before sunrise. The air greets you with the scent of damp straw, flickering candle wax, and the faint stench of last night's onion stew. Your mattress? Think lumpy hay in a burlap sack. At 30 years old, you're considered a veteran, respected, seasoned, and one rogue infection away from total retirement. You stretch, cough politely into a rag, and gear up for a day of healing, a term we'll use loosely. A stethoscope? Not in your toolkit, it hasn't been invented. Soap? Please. You rely on incense and judgmental stares for sanitation. You call yourself a healer, a scholar, but nobody needs to know that once, you treated a tummy ache with mashed garlic and pigeon feathers. That secret stays under wraps. Your morning ritual? A goblet of warm urine. Not yours, someone did the honors. Your first patient showed up at sunrise with a jar of still warm pee. Freshness is key. You treat it like fine wine. Your body is governed by the four sacred humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Forget bacteria or viruses. That's future nonsense. Right now, the body is like a great bubbling pot of medieval soup, and your job is to make sure no ingredient overpowers the others. Let's say your patient is red in the face and seething with anger. Too much blood, seasonal, emotional, or toxic. Your cure? Bloodletting. Patient is pale and lethargic? That's excess phlegm, likely from cold porridge or a moody feud. You consult your trusty monk's chart from the 1100s. Legend says each vein is linked to a different organ. Confidence is key. Patient lies down, arm outstretched. You tie a tourniquet, mutter some Latin to sound scholarly, then make the cut. Blood pours. You nod gravely. Your assistant collapses, no surprise there. You collect the flow in a clay jar, carefully secure the lid, and sip a dramatic gulp of water. You begin your questioning. What did you eat? How often do you bathe? Answer: never. Has Mercury crossed paths with Saturn lately? Next, a silent stare into the flames, 5 intense seconds, followed by a verdict: an imbalance of humors, maybe a bit of bile. Definitely not demonic, unless conditions worsen on Sundays. Your prescription? A paste of crushed mint and powdered snail shell, avoidance of cold breezes, and a side of astrological alignment. Venus in retrograde might be messing with their spleen. Clean bandages? That's luxurious. Soap? Theoretical. Probably used a cloth never washed since the Great Plague. The blade? Caked with dried blood, your relic of Saint Sebastian. No one questions your methods, and the patient leaves nodding. You re-enter your surgery chamber, scroll scanning your robe, and announce: the phlegm's heavy, Venus is damp this week. Nobody really knows what that means, least of all you, but they pay, thank you, and leave impressed. You, O celestial wizard of leeches and charm, proceed to your next patient with only candlelight, an astrological compass, and misplaced trust in those humors. You stride confidently into your next appointment with the solemn dignity of someone who's about to cut a man open using the same knife you used earlier to slice your cheese. It's surgery day, not because the moon's in the right position, or the humors are well aligned, but because every other remedy has failed. You've tried prayers, you've tried herbs, you've even tried slicing open a boil with all the precision of a drunk butcher at market. But nothing screams professional medicine quite like applying live worms to someone's body while nodding solemnly like it all makes sense. Leeches are your ultimate cure-all. They're the Swiss Army knife of medieval healthcare. Fever? Leech. Headache? Leech. Swollen ankle? Leech. Crippling heartache from a failed courtship or maybe trembling from an encounter with a mysterious ghost? Leech, leech, and more leeches. You carry them around in a little jar, lovingly tucked into your medical satchel, right next to your grimy bandages and your Latin scrolls you barely understand. Now your next patient? A middle-aged woman who swears she's possessed. She's been mumbling to herself, pacing halls, humming church hymns in reverse, and at one point threw a spoon at her cousin's head. You listen with the practiced concern of a man who has no idea what's happening but wants to sound like he does. You nod slowly, call in the local priest just to be safe, sprinkle holy water in every direction like seasoning, and light a candle that smells like goat fat and despair. Then, with the conviction of a man who's definitely winging it, you tell her family that she's been overtaken by melancholy. Maybe it's too much black bile. Maybe it's a minor demon named Gregory. Either way, your tone is authoritative, and that's what counts. And you have a book, after all. It doesn't matter what's actually in it. You open it occasionally, squint at the pages like you're reading scripture, and point dramatically to nothing in particular. Sometimes you murmur phrases in Latin you don't fully understand. Other times you just whisper, "Inflammatio bilis nigre," and everyone nods like it makes sense. You don't bother yourself with minor tasks like measuring herbs or boiling bark. That's the apothecary's job. Your job? Talk about bile, point at the sky, and prescribe instructions vague enough to sound wise but impossible to verify. Apply a cooling tonic with lunar influence. Whatever that means. Luckily, your patients often trust the apothecary more than you. They're the ones living in town, chatting with everyone, blending herbs with a smile and a sprinkle of gossip. Their shops smell of thyme and honey, not blood and old cloth. And more importantly, they haven't bled anyone out this week. Truth is, neither of you really knows what these herbs do. You work off tradition, superstition, and the deeply unreliable testimony of a monk who swears chamomile cured his goat's depression. So you grind, mash, and boil your concoctions with enthusiasm, adding a little Latin flair for drama. Sometimes you mix in honey, not because it heals anything, but because everything tastes like soil and people complain less when it's sweetened. You call it a restorative spleen elixir. They call it not terrible. And if it works, it's a miracle. If it doesn't, it's God's mysterious will. Maybe the patient lacked enough incense, or faith, or maybe they were cursed by a neighbor with suspicious eyebrows. You've learned to roll with it. Your workday continues. Another patient, another diagnosis. You whisper a quick, "May God guide my blade," before pulling out your knife. You also carry a small crucifix, not for the patient, but just in case someone accuses you of thinking too much. It's a visual defense mechanism. After all, you are a man of science. A blood-soaked, vaguely confused, Latin-quoting version of science, but still. And then, sometimes, there's no way around it. The limb has to go. Amputation isn't your favorite procedure, but you've done it enough to fake confidence. You don't have anesthesia. You don't have antiseptic. You barely have a table that doesn't wobble. What you do have is grit, a knife, and a bucket. The patient usually bites down on a stick, or a belt, or nothing at all if they're especially tough or unconscious. You hack away with all the grace of a carpenter late for dinner. There's screaming, there's blood, and you pretend it's under control. Because sometimes, this is the only way to save a life, or, at the very least, delay death until someone else can take the blame. You hear coughing in the distance. You pretend not to. It's been a long, messy day. You've drained blood, fainted an assistant, applied leeches to 3 different people with wildly different complaints, and amputated a leg with the steady hand of someone who's never actually used a saw on purpose. You're ready to hang up your robe for the night, or at least wring it out. But just as you're blowing out the last candle and convincing yourself that distant cough was definitely someone else's problem, you hear it. A commotion, bells, laughter, incense in the air. The stained glass windows down the road are flickering with torchlight. That's no ordinary sound, it's church. And not the serious kind. You wander over, drawn by the noise, and step into the cathedral expecting monks in solemn chant or bishops reading from Holy Scripture. Instead, there's a man standing up front, wearing a bishop's mitre backwards. His robe is twisted, his face is streaked with ash and wine. He's just blessed the crowd, by sticking out his tongue, and mooning the altar. Welcome to the Feast of Fools. It's possibly the wildest, most outrageous thing ever tolerated by the church. For one sacred and ridiculous day, everything turns upside down. Picture it. A gangly teenager from the choir, barely able to grow a beard, paraded through the streets on a throne made of beer barrels. His bishop's robes are too big. His mitre is made from pigskin. He blesses people by flinging cabbage at them. This isn't a joke, it's tradition. The Lord of Misrule is crowned and everything serious becomes farce. The sacred becomes silly, reverence becomes parody, and it doesn't just happen outside. It happens right in the heart of Christendom. Inside the cathedral, the choir boys are dancing. The canons are shouting jokes not fit for polite company. The procession includes people dressed as animals, women, demons, whatever sparks chaos. The crowd howls with laughter. But there's something deeper underneath it all. The absurdity, the parody, the chaos, it's not just for fun. It's a mirror, a way for the people to talk back to power without being burned for it. Because when you laugh at something sacred, you reveal its cracks. And medieval Europe had plenty of cracks. Take the ass mass, for example. A donkey is led into the cathedral and allowed to bray during key moments of the liturgy. Sometimes the donkey even responds to the priest's lines. The final chant of the service? Not amen, but a full-throated hee-haw. Other parody masses praised gluttony, lust, and the holiness of wine. Priests stumbled through mock blessings while someone in the back lit manure instead of incense. It's crude, it's shocking, but it's not meaningless. It's satire. Every ridiculous moment hides a critique of a church growing more powerful and more distant from the people it claimed to shepherd. When a fake bishop solemnly blesses a string of sausages, it's not just comedy, it's protest. A gentle way of saying, we see you. And we know. And here's the wild part. Some of the clergy enjoyed it. Not the high-ranking bishops or papal representatives, of course. But the subdeacons? The choir boys? The low-ranking churchmen with little power and a front-row seat to hypocrisy? They looked forward to it. It was their moment to mock authority, to play the fool, to indulge in performance with no consequences. They roasted their bosses. They lampooned church politics. They made sacred ritual into circus. And for once, they were the stars of the show. It was irreverent, but deeply clerical. Because the only people who could parody the church this perfectly were the ones who knew it best. The ones inside. The ones who knew what was sacred, and therefore knew exactly how to flip it. The Feast of Fools wasn't just a wild party, it was a pressure valve. In a world ruled by hierarchy, fear, and punishment, it gave people a sanctioned space to rebel, even if only through laughter. And for that one day, the fool wasn't just tolerated, he was king. Of course, not everyone was laughing. The church hierarchy grew increasingly nervous. After all, when peasants mock priests, and choir boys dress up as bishops, the line between sacred and profane starts to blur. It's one thing to joke, it's another to openly challenge power with a punchline. So eventually, the church began to crack down. Bishops wrote stern letters, decrees were issued, feast days were cancelled, but the spirit didn't die, it just got cleverer. People adapted, they moved the celebration into back alleys, behind closed doors, or disguised it under different names. The Feast of Fools lived on. It splintered and transformed, feeding the roots of future festivals, carnival, Mardi Gras, masquerade balls. All keeping the same basic idea. Wear a mask, question authority, turn the world upside down for a night. And really, that's what made it so powerful. It wasn't just silly costumes and bad Latin jokes. It was rebellion disguised as revelry. Laughter used as resistance. A middle finger dressed up in sacred robes. Even during revolutions centuries later, that same spirit resurfaced. The laughter moved from church pews to street parades. The targets changed, from bishops to kings, but the message stayed the same. Nothing is too sacred to be mocked. Especially power. And it worked. Because for those brief hours, everyone played a different role. Nobles pretended to be beggars. Beggars pretended to be gods. A world built on rank and rigidity was turned inside out. For one glorious moment, even the Pope could be a joke. And that was the point. The fool wasn't just a clown, he was a mirror. A mirror held up to power's face, reflecting all its absurdity, hypocrisy, and fragility. But just as one tradition dies, another one is born. Fast forward a few hundred years, and we're no longer in the cathedral. Now we're in Rome, and the laughter has been replaced with soft music, candlelight, and something far more dangerous than mockery, luxury. The food smells divine. The hall is packed with velvet cushions, golden goblets, and enough wine to fill a canal. But this isn't just a dinner party. It's a weapon. You've been invited to a Borgia banquet. And you don't decline a Borgia banquet. Ever. These weren't just meals. They were meticulously engineered performances. Every course designed to seduce. Every glass of wine a potential trap. The lighting, the music, even the placement of guests, it was all calculated to disarm you. To confuse admiration with fear. You were told to eat. And so you did, because saying no to their hospitality could offend. But enjoying it too much? That could be even worse. At the heart of it all was Lucrezia Borgia. More than just the Pope's daughter, she was a force of nature, beautiful, brilliant, and utterly impossible to ignore. Her golden hair, her sharp wit, her cool grace. She didn't have to speak to control a room. All she had to do was look at you. She hosted the most infamous affairs in Rome. And everyone knew. If you were at her table, you were playing a very delicate game. And in the shadows of every feast stood Cesare Borgia, dressed in black velvet, trimmed with gold, sword always within reach. He didn't need to smile. His presence alone could send a chill down your spine. He could raise a glass to your health, and slip a thread into the toast without ever raising his voice. People didn't just fear him, they watched him constantly, because if Cesare laughed at your joke, it meant you were safe. For now, but if his expression didn't change, if he stayed silent, unreadable, then every bite you took after that felt heavier. More dangerous. And here's the chilling truth about dining with the Borgias. You might not even know you're in danger until it's far too late. The poison, if there is any, doesn't hit you right away. It slips into your goblet without changing the color, without altering the flavor. You laugh, you drink, you compliment the host, and you leave the banquet smiling. Then, a day or two later, it begins. A twisting in your stomach, a creeping fever, a burning that no wine can soothe, and by the time the pain has you doubled over, it's already too late. The damage is done, the poison has won, but will anyone be blamed? No, no witnesses, no evidence, only whispers. He seemed fine after the banquet, they'll say. Such a shame. If fingers point, they point toward the air, toward vague rumors, toward the inevitable silence that follows powerful shadows. And what about the lucky few who survive? They come back changed, they come back quieter, more cautious, because they know now. The most beautiful feasts are sometimes traps in disguise. Some stories are more dramatic, like the one about the Spanish envoy, staunchly opposed to Pope Alexander's rule, who died peacefully in his bed the night after a Borgia banquet. Unofficial examination? Lips turned black, internal organs scorched. The official story? He passed peacefully in his sleep. Of course. Or another tale, whispered in the back rooms of taverns. A foreign diplomat collapses face first into his candied quince. The room freezes. Goblets pause mid-air. Servants look to Cesare. Cesare, unmoved, sighs. Remove him. He has lost his appetite. Was that one true? Maybe, maybe not. That's the danger of legends. They blur just enough to make you doubt your own memory. And then there was the most infamous event of all, the one even the clergy couldn't deny, the banquet of chestnuts. Let me set the scene. The Vatican, candlelight flickering across frescoes, long tables groaning with roast meats, glazed fruits, golden chalices overflowing with wine. And in the middle of this decadent feast, a floor strewn with chestnuts. Hundreds of them, dozens of women, courtesans, dancers, rumored mistresses, ordered to strip down and crawl across the marble to gather the chestnuts using only their mouths. No hands, no assistance, just knees, teeth, and candlelight, all while high-ranking members of the church and nobility recline on velvet cushions, sipping wine, tossing coins, laughing, cheering. Every detail, the flicker of gold on bare skin, the echo of heels against marble, the scent of spiced pork mingling with perfume, engineered to blur the line between celebration and degradation, between admiration and domination. And that was the whole point. Because if the Pope himself could turn the Vatican into a den of spectacle, if cardinals could watch this parade of indulgence from beneath sacred frescoes, then what, exactly, was still sacred? Nothing. Under Pope Alexander, the Vatican wasn't just a holy place. It was a stage, and every banquet was a performance of power. Every guest an audience, every course, every game, every whispered comment calculated to remind you, you are here because we allow it. And when the feast ended, you left changed, not just because of what you saw, but because of what you now knew. That power didn't just rule by fear or wealth or divine right. Power seduced. Power turned sin into spectacle. Power laughed when you flinched. But Lucrezia, oh, Lucrezia, she wasn't just a bystander in this grand theater. She wasn't a victim, either. People always try to reduce her to a pawn, a poisoned flower tucked between the sharper thorns of Cesare and Alexander. But that's not the full picture. She was a strategist. Lucrezia hosted these feasts. She arranged the seating, chose the music, curated the performances. She welcomed poets, nobles, cardinals, diplomats, all under one frescoed roof, and made each of them feel both seen and unsure of their place. That was her gift, elegant uncertainty. When she smiled, no one knew if it meant approval or doom. And Cesare? Cesare was the shadow in the wings. Never far, never loud, but always watching. His presence was like a knife's reflection in candlelight, silent, sharp, impossible to ignore. They were a team, in a way. She, the velvet glove. He, the hidden blade. And all around them spun the myth of the Borgia poison. It became part of the dinner conversation, the theater, the suspense. Every laugh tinged with fear. Every compliment to the chef seasoned with paranoia. Because the truth was, no one ever saw it coming. It was the perfect crime. Delayed, untraceable, and drenched in elegance. And whether or not every rumor was true, that hardly mattered. The fear was real. The message was clear. If you opposed the Borgias, if you whispered against them, blocked a papal decision, insulted their family, you might find yourself invited to dinner. And if you accepted, well, bon appetit. But what made these stories stick wasn't just the scandal. It was the symbolism, the way power cloaked itself in luxury, the way a goblet of wine could double as a weapon, the way a smile could be sharper than any sword. The Borgias didn't just rule, they mesmerized. Their banquets weren't just feasts. They were statements. They turned Rome into a stage, the Vatican into a theater, and every guest into either a performer or a prop. And as centuries passed, those feasts didn't disappear, they evolved. The memory of them, at least. They became whispered warnings, Gothic novels, operas, HBO scripts, and Netflix specials. Because the image, a poisoned cup, a smiling pope, a banquet laced with danger, it just wouldn't go away. It's lodged in our imagination like a splinter. That idea that beneath beauty, there's rot. Beneath power, a dagger. That behind every toast, there might be a target. And the most terrifying part? They never had to lift a finger. They let the fear do the work. Because true power doesn't scream. It whispers. It smiles across a table, raises a glass, and lets you wonder, was that the last sip I'll ever take? But this story, like all good medieval legends, doesn't end with a bang. It fades, quietly, elegantly. The feast winds down, the music softens. One by one, the guests leave, full of rich food, fear, and questions they'll never dare ask aloud. And what of Lucrezia? Her power, though real, was never permanent. Eventually, she faded from the spotlight, married off again, sent north, her name still glowing with rumors. Her estate passed without drama to a family ally. No trial, no scandal, just silence. But that silence was loud. And the Spanish envoy, that loud opponent of Pope Alexander? Gone, peacefully, they said, the night after a feast. No signs of struggle, but those who saw him last say his lips were black. That's all. Others met more theatrical ends. Like the diplomat who collapsed mid-dessert, face down in candied quince, fork still in hand, the entire hall frozen in disbelief, wine halfway to lips. And Cesare, calm as a winter storm, just sighed. Remove him, he said, not even raising his voice. He has lost his appetite. The performance continued. Dessert was served. Conversation resumed. Because to acknowledge fear was to show weakness. And weakness at a Borgia feast? That was fatal. Were these stories real? Were they embellished by frightened ambassadors and jealous rivals? It doesn't matter. What mattered was the legacy. The power of the myth. A myth that outlived the family. That grew larger than life. That haunted Europe's imagination long after the last candle was extinguished. These weren't just dinner parties. They were cautionary tales. They were whispered in taverns, dramatized in plays, scribbled into the margins of noblemen's journals. Tales of golden goblets, poisoned cherries, seductive smiles hiding sharpened threats. Tales that warned. Beware the feast too beautiful, the host too gracious, the smile too still, because when pleasure is this perfectly constructed, it becomes performance. And when power is masked with silk and wine, it becomes untraceable. It becomes untouchable, and that's why the Borgia legacy has never truly died. It just changed costumes. The church that once burned with incense now glows with candlelight on theater stages. The laughter that once filled banquet halls now echoes through Netflix dramas. The fear, the tension, the elegance, it's all still here. Because the real danger wasn't the poison. It was the confidence with which it was served. Now, let's step away from bloodletting and banquets for a moment, and shift towards something a little more balanced. Something older, maybe even wiser. We're heading west, far from the Vatican, beyond the courts of kings and bishops, to a rugged, rain-soaked corner of medieval Europe where justice had a very different face. Welcome to medieval Ireland, home of the Brian laws. Unlike the systems dominating much of Europe, where rule was tied to violence, hierarchy, and divine authority, Ireland developed something else entirely. Something more human, more intimate. a legal tradition built not on punishment, but peacekeeping. At the core of Brian law was a radical question. Not, who is guilty, but, how do we restore balance? If someone stole from you, you didn't march off to a dungeon or demand their hand. You sought repayment, often 2 or 3 times the value of what was taken. Not because the law was soft, but because it was relational. Your neighbor wasn't a stranger. They were part of your world. You saw them at the market. Your children played together. Justice had to consider that. If someone assaulted a member of your family, there was no hanging. No public whipping. Instead, the injury was valued, compensated with cattle or coin. There were actual tables outlining how much a black eye was worth. How many cows for a broken finger? How much silver for a cracked rib? It sounds clinical, maybe even cold, but think about it. What mattered wasn't the spectacle of justice. It was the restoration of harmony. Because in a society where people lived side by side for generations, vengeance couldn't be the answer. Coexistence had to be. That's why the Irish courts didn't revolve around kings or military force. They revolved around the Brians, traveling judges, trained in oral tradition and years of apprenticeship. Their authority didn't come from bloodline or God. It came from trust, from wisdom, from knowing how to listen. They were problem solvers, mediators, and poets of peace. In fact, some became so respected their names show up in ancient Irish poetry, celebrated not for power, but for finding peace where others only saw conflict. And it worked. Disputes were settled, feuds were calmed, villages kept moving, because everyone knew that revenge was a fire that burned too many houses. Better to trade cattle and keep your neighbors. And here's something even more revolutionary. Women had rights under Brian law. Not perfect ones, not equal by modern standards, but rights nonetheless. They could own property, enter contracts, and even divorce under certain terms. Compare that to the legal status of women under feudal or church law, and it's clear. This wasn't just a different system. It was a different mindset. But make no mistake, Brian law wasn't some utopia. It had its flaws, its loopholes, its ugly moments. But at its heart was something rare for its time. A belief that justice should repair, not destroy. That if you wanted to survive in a world of kinship and clan, you couldn't just punish wrongs. You had to heal wounds. Now, let's look a little deeper at what made Brian law so unique, because it didn't just reshape justice. It redefined what it meant to belong. In early medieval Ireland, land wasn't owned the way we think of it today. You didn't buy a field, plant your flag, and claim it forever. Instead, land was held collectively by the fine, your extended kin group. It was passed through generations, not as private property, but as a shared inheritance. You had rights to use the land, but those rights were tied to your role in the community. Leave the clan, and you lost access. Your place in the legal world was inseparable from your place in the tribe. And when something went wrong, when someone stole, injured, or insulted, you didn't just deal with the individual. You dealt with the family. Responsibility was shared. If you couldn't pay your fine, your kin helped cover it. If someone hurt you, it was your kin who demanded compensation. Justice was not just between two people, it was between two networks. That's why theft, for example, wasn't punished with mutilation or death. It was punished with repayment, often double or triple what was stolen. Because the point wasn't suffering, it was deterrence, restoration, keeping things from escalating into long-term feuds. And it worked, because when your bad decision risked your family's cattle or your clan's reputation, you thought twice. Reputation was everything, and to measure that reputation, Brian law had one of its most fascinating inventions, the honor price. Every person had a legal value based on their social standing. It wasn't about money, it was about dignity. A chieftain, a poet, a blacksmith, a freeman, all had different honor prices. If someone insulted or wronged you, your compensation was calculated based on that value. Think of it as a social credit score, but for your respect. And yes, the system had hierarchy, but it wasn't rigid like a caste. If you earned status, say, by becoming a master craftsman or a revered bard, your honor price could go up. In some ways, it was a merit-based economy of dignity. But what's even more remarkable is how egalitarian it was compared to feudal systems. Your role mattered, your craft mattered, your wisdom mattered. You didn't have to be a warrior or a noble to have standing. And the Brians? They weren't enforcers, they were interpreters. They memorized vast bodies of law, passed orally for centuries, and applied them case by case, with empathy and precedent. Their decisions weren't decrees, they were negotiations, shaped by context, tradition, and community needs. In fact, one of the most advanced ideas in Brehon law was something we now call restorative justice. It wasn't about locking people away. It wasn't about dominance. It was about asking a profound question. How do we make the community whole again? So imagine living under this system, where justice wasn't a tool of kings, but a bridge between neighbors. Where you couldn't just eliminate your enemies, because their family lived right next to yours. You had to find a way to live together, to repair, not retaliate. And that's what made the Brehon tradition so powerful. It was shaped for a world where isolation was impossible. Villages were small, clans were interconnected, everyone knew everyone else's business. Conflict wasn't rare, but letting it fester? That was dangerous, too costly. So instead, they created a law that reflected human reality, messy, emotional, tied to land and legacy. Let's talk about marriage. Under Brehon law, marriage wasn't a holy sacrament sealed by rings and sermons. It was a contract, negotiated like a business deal. Families met, terms were set, property discussed, and yes, livestock played a part. The rights of both partners were outlined clearly. Who brought what, who kept what in case of separation. Because separation? That was allowed. Divorce existed. It wasn't always easy, and there were limits, but the law recognized that sometimes people just shouldn't stay together. And here's something even more unexpected. If a man left his wife and took the family cow, she could take legal action to get the cow back. That wasn't scandalous. It was justice. And all of this, land, marriage, honor, was part of a legal philosophy that emphasized coexistence. Because in a world without prisons, where banishment meant death or destitution, justice had to do something different. It had to weave people back together, not tear them further apart. Even serious crimes, like assault or murder, followed this principle. There were detailed charts for every kind of injury, what it cost, how it was valued, who owed what to whom. A punch to the nose? That had a price. A severed finger? Higher. A death? That could bankrupt a family, but the compensation was expected. Now, was this perfect? Of course not. The wealthy could still bend outcomes. Power still protected itself. And over time, even this egalitarian system began to mirror the inequalities of the world around it. But compared to the dungeons and executions of feudal Europe, Brehon law was something else entirely. Pragmatic, nuanced, and deeply personal. And in many ways, it was centuries ahead of its time. Because modern legal thinkers are still wrestling with these ideas today. How do we make justice about relationships, not just rules? How do we restore dignity, not just enforce punishment? The Irish, 1,000 years ago, were already trying to answer those questions. But as with all good systems that challenge the status quo, Brehon law eventually met its match, and that match came in the form of foreign power. When the English crown expanded its control over Ireland, it didn't just bring armies. It brought courts, judges, statutes, a whole new idea of justice, rooted in punishment and control. To the English, Brehon law wasn't just strange, it was dangerous. It was too fluid, too communal, too Irish. And in a world where empires were built on hierarchy and obedience, that couldn't stand. By the 17th century, Brehons were outlawed. Their rulings dismissed, their wisdom labeled superstitious or barbaric. Gaelic lords who continued to uphold the system were branded as rebels or traitors. English courts took over. Justice became something handed down, not worked out. No more negotiations between clans. No more cattle fines. Now, there were prisons, executions, land seizures. The logic had shifted, from balance to punishment, from community to control. And yet, the memory of Brehon law didn't vanish. It survived in whispers, in stories passed down through generations, in secret meetings where elders still settled disputes the old way. Because people remembered what it meant to belong to a system that valued peace over power. And here's the thing, Brehon law wasn't just some footnote in Irish history. It was a window into a different kind of justice, one where wisdom trumped wrath, and where laws weren't built to crush, but to connect. Even today, its principles echo in modern movements like restorative justice, community mediation, and indigenous legal revival. The world is beginning to rediscover what the Irish knew long ago, that accountability doesn't always require a cage, and that reparation can be more powerful than revenge. You see, Brehon law asked deeper questions than most legal codes. Not just what happened, but what was lost, and how do we restore it? It understood something many modern systems still wrestle with, that justice isn't just about guilt. It's about relationships, between families, between neighbors, between the individual and the tribe. And when you think about it like that, it's no wonder it threatened colonial powers. Because a legal system like that, one that prioritized balance over control, healing over harm, that's not just justice, that's resistance. And that resistance, quiet though it was, lingered long after the official scrolls were burned and the courtrooms repurposed. Because you can outlaw a law, but you can't erase a culture. The Irish didn't forget how to solve problems without violence. They didn't forget how to sit in a circle, speak the truth, and find a way forward. The memory of honor prices, clan negotiations, and land shared in common never truly vanished. It just adapted. It went underground, into oral histories, into songs, into the spaces between generations. And while Europe's castles grew taller, and its laws more brutal, Ireland kept remembering. But what made Brian law stand apart wasn't just its procedures, it was its philosophy. It understood that justice wasn't about isolating the guilty. It was about reweaving the social fabric after it had been torn. It asked not just, who did this, but how do we heal from this together? Even its punishments were shaped by proximity. If you wronged someone, they saw you again. In the village, at the market, you couldn't disappear behind stone walls. You had to face what you'd done, and the people you'd done it to. That's powerful, and rare, because accountability, when done right, is not about shame. It's about connection, about restoring trust, not just for the individual, but for the entire community. And that's something our modern world is still trying to get right. We've built systems based on removal, on locking people away, on assuming that pain cancels pain. But the Brians knew better. They knew that true justice wasn't about winning, it was about mending. Even their approach to land carried that ethos. In a time when kings were carving up Europe, claiming forests and rivers and farms as personal fiefdoms, the Irish believed land was collective. That it belonged to the fine, the kin group, not to any one man. It was worked together, shared together, defended together. Leave the group, lose the land. Not as punishment, but as a simple reality. Land wasn't a commodity, it was a relationship, and that worldview, that everything is interconnected, that no act stands alone, ran through every branch of the law. It was poetic, practical, and deeply, profoundly communal. It also made Brian law nearly impossible to export, and nearly impossible to rule over. Because it couldn't be understood from a throne. You had to live it, walk it, earn its trust, and that's what made it dangerous to empires. It wasn't built for power. It was built for belonging. By now, you can probably feel it, the quiet strength at the heart of Brian law. It wasn't just a set of rules. It was a social contract, written not in ink, but in trust. You didn't just obey because you had to. You participated because you belonged. And the most beautiful part? This legal system treated reputation like currency. Your standing in the community, your honor price, was everything. It was your shield, your resume, your insurance policy. And unlike birthright nobility, it could be earned. Poets, blacksmiths, midwives, even Brians themselves. Each could rise in respect based on wisdom, skill, or service. This made justice feel personal, not bureaucratic. People weren't numbers, they were names. You didn't go to court. You went to someone's home, or a hilltop, or a neutral clearing, where elders listened, witnesses spoke, and resolutions were crafted, not imposed. And here's the twist. These courts weren't just reactive. They were preventative. The law wasn't only about fixing harm, it was about keeping peace before harm even happened. Disputes over cattle, marriage, dowries, insults, so much of it was negotiated before swords were ever drawn. Because every wrong threatened social balance, and in a tribal world, balance was survival. Even injury law had incredible detail. A missing tooth, a broken nail, a bruised cheek, they all had specific compensation values. It wasn't just about harm, it was about dignity. You didn't just lose a finger, you lost a part of your labor, your pride, your future. And the law understood that. This meant every decision wasn't just financial, it was emotional. To pay a fine was to acknowledge harm. To accept a settlement was to end a feud. Justice was measured in healing, not headlines. And yet, all of this deep, interconnected, centuries-old framework, was eventually labeled primitive. Not because it failed, but because it resisted conquest. It didn't bow to kings. It didn't fit into boxes. It was too flexible, too communal, too free. So, it had to go. But the funny thing about oral systems is, they're hard to kill. Brian law lived on in secret, in song, in the ways neighbors quietly settled disputes without ever involving a sheriff. It lived in the muscle memory of a people who never quite trusted the new courts. And in some ways, it still lives today, in how Irish culture values storytelling, negotiation, and the collective good. And maybe that's the legacy we should be paying attention to, not just the specific laws, but the spirit behind them. Because at its core, Brian law didn't ask, how do we dominate? It asked, how do we live together? And that's a question every society, no matter how modern, still wrestles with. It's tempting to think of justice as cold and mechanical. Someone does wrong, they're punished. End of story. But in the Brian world, every wrong had ripples. A feud between two men might fracture an entire village. A stolen cow might trigger generations of distrust. The law had to look beyond the act and into its consequences. That's why family played such a big role. Your kin didn't just support you, they shared your consequences. If you committed a crime, your family paid the fine. Not because they were guilty, but because they were responsible for you. And in return, they had a stake in making sure you stayed honest, stayed accountable. It wasn't surveillance, it was social responsibility. And while it could be oppressive in some ways, it also created a network of interdependence. You weren't alone, you were part of something bigger. And this connectedness wasn't just legal, it was spiritual. Irish society was deeply tied to land, to ancestry, to rhythm and ritual. Brian law echoed that. It didn't separate law from life, it wove them together. The legal calendar was synced with the agricultural one. Courts were sometimes held outdoors, where oaths were spoken under sacred trees or beside ancient stones. Even contracts might include poetic phrases, invocations to nature, or blessings to ensure fairness. Because law wasn't just a function, it was a living tradition. And as new systems swept across Europe, rigid, written, bureaucratic, Ireland's old laws started to look untamed. Maybe even dangerous, not because they didn't work, but because they empowered communities, not rulers. So they were targeted, not just by armies, but by culture itself. English legal scholars dismissed Brian law as barbarous. The church called it pagan. Colonial authorities called it backwards. And slowly, piece by piece, it was erased. But not entirely. Fragments of Brian law resurfaced centuries later. In archives, in folk memory, in unexpected corners of modern Irish law. And as ideas like restorative justice, community mediation, and indigenous legal traditions gain momentum globally, people are once again asking, what if the law wasn't about punishment? What if it was about repair? So here we are, centuries later, still circling back to the same ancient question. What does justice really mean? In a world where headlines scream punishment and prisons overflow, maybe it's time to listen to the Brians, to those old voices that whispered instead of shouted. That said, justice is not a hammer. It's a thread, and when something breaks, you don't smash it further. You try to stitch it back together. That's the gift Brian law still offers us, not just as a historical curiosity, but as a living possibility. A system built not on fear, but relationship. Not on isolation, but responsibility. Not on punishment, but reparation. It wasn't perfect. No system is. Women had fewer rights than men. Slaves had even fewer. Power still tilted the scales. But within its limits, Brian law created space for something radical, human dignity. Even in judgment, there was respect. And maybe that's what we've lost. Or at least forgotten. Because while we've built towering institutions and coded laws into marble, we've often severed them from the people they're meant to serve. We've turned justice into a spectacle, a contest, a punishment machine. But what if we brought it back down to earth? What if we looked at crime not as a breach of rules, but as a wound to a community? What if the goal wasn't just punishment, but healing? That's the road the Brians walked. Slowly, patiently, often barefoot. They didn't need robes or gavels. Just wisdom, memory, and the willingness to listen. And maybe, just maybe, that's the kind of justice we still need. A justice that doesn't ask, who do we punish? But asks instead, who was hurt? What was lost? And how do we make it whole again? That, in the end, was the heartbeat of the law in medieval Ireland. And even now, across time and silence, it still echoes.